Greetings in the name of Christ on this beautiful Tuesday morning, May 19th. Wow, we're moving down the pike, aren't we? May's going to be over here before we know it. As somebody said the other day, Memorial Day is canceled. So, we're living into this time where we're not sure when it will end, and for some that is not easy, of course. And so we need to hold on to one another, hold together, so that we can remember that we are connected and that God is always with us. So in 1997, in September of that year, this congregation took 33 members of its 110 members to Scotland for a trip. I used a piece from George MacLeod the other day about George MacLeod in this video, actually yesterday on Monday. And I'm going to continue in that vein today, reading more from Listening for the Heartbeat of God, A Celtic Spirituality by J. Philip Newell. And I think I'll be using this book for the remainder of the week so we can learn a little more about this wonderful Scotsman who helped to build the Abbey on the island of Iona, which was one of the stops of this group back in 1997. It's a place I've never been, and it is a place I really would love to see sometime. So I'm going to begin today with reading from the 11th chapter of Romans, the ending of that chapter. I'm continuing to use the Message as I do these daily readings, and here's what the Apostle Paul has to say to the Romans. In one way or another, God makes sure that we all experience what it means to be outside, so that God can personally open the door and welcome us back in. Have you ever come on anything quite like this extravagant generosity of God, this deep, deep wisdom? It's way over our heads. We'll never figure it out. Is there anyone around who can explain God? Anyone smart enough to tell God what to do? Anyone who has done God such a huge favor that God has to ask this person's advice? Everything comes from God. Everything happens through God. Everything ends up in God. Always glory, always praise. Yes, yes, yes. This is a chapter when Paul has been talking about the Jews and Gentiles and their coming in and out of the tradition. This is from continuing a little bit of history about George MacLeod. He was born in 1895 into a family that was probably the greatest ecclesiastical dynasty in Scotland. The MacLeods of Morvern on the west coast had given more than 550 years of ordained service to the established church. MacLeod's was a privileged as well as an ecclesiastical family. He had childhood memories, for instance, of a written menu for the evening meal and being waited on by maids. His background was broadened by periods of study in England, at Winchester and Oxford. When the First World War came, he served as an officer with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, seeing heavy fighting on the Western Front, and his bravery won him the Military Cross and the Croix de Guerre. The war profoundly affected MacLeod. He witnessed, as did so many, the slaughter of friends and companions. So shaken was he by what he saw that he later described himself as falling apart at this point. Going through half a bottle of whiskey and 50 cigarettes a day, I was going to hell in a hurry, he said. But as he traveled back to the front after a leave of absence, MacLeod reached a critical turning point in his life. Not even waiting until the train reached its destination, he knelt down in the railway compartment and gave himself to Christ. It was typical of the man to act as soon as he heard within himself the compelling truth that he needed to change. It was, of course, years before he understood many of the implications of his sudden conversion experience in the railway carriage. But after the war, MacLeod trained for the Church of Scotland ministry. His father was a Presbyterian, his mother a Quaker, and during his years at Winchester he had been confirmed as an Anglican, so he now described himself as a walking ecumenical disaster. After training for the ministry, he became assistant minister at St. Giles in Edinburgh, Scotland's principal cathedral, and then collegiate minister at the prestigious Church of St. Cuthbert's, where he was a very popular preacher. But increasingly, he became aware of what he called the two nations of his country, the rich and the poor. So disturbed was he by this division that in 1930 he accepted, to the surprise of the establishment, a call to the parish of Govan, the shipbuilding area in Glasgow, marked in the Hungry 30s by severe unemployment and widespread poverty. It was during this period that MacLeod moved from a fairly straightforward form of high Presbyterianism towards a more mystical as well as a more political spirituality. This combination of the mystical and the political is what is so remarkable about MacLeod. The true mark of Christian spirituality, he now declared, is to get one's teeth into things. Painstaking service to humankind's most material needs is the essence of Christian spirituality. In other words, to move more deeply into life, and especially into its places of struggle and suffering. Like those he was seeing in Glasgow, is to move closer to the life of Christ, the light that is within even the darkest of situations. The word spiritual, he believed, was often dangerously misunderstood. People generally imagine that to go mystical, as he put it, is to turn away from the affairs of the world. It is rather to go more deeply into life, to find God at the heart of life, deeper than any wrong, and to liberate God's goodness within us and in our relationships, both individually and collectively. That's quite a tall order, to go more deeply into life, to find God at the heart of life, deeper than any wrong, and to liberate God's goodness within us and in our relationships, both individually and collectively. I think it's extremely difficult in our culture today to find God more deeper in life, past all the wrongs, because there is so much blame going on today. Finding that balance is so critical for us. And George MacLeod helped model it for us as he lived more deeply into the life he understood in God and began to weave more fully this Celtic spirituality into his life. I'll read more about that in the days remaining this week. But until then, let us turn to God in prayer. God of life, the God of the deepest life we can possibly know, how grateful we are to be your disciples, to be the learners about your way, and in that learning to be so changed by you that we deeply love and more perhaps quickly come to know others in a new way, in a more loving way, in a more grace-filled way, especially those with whom we differ. We pray, gracious God, as we move through this pandemic, that you will help us to find a balanced way together. Whatever side of the political aisle, whatever side of the spiritual aisle, whatever side of life we find ourselves on, that we can find a middle way, a way that is a way through you and to you to find the balance we need together to move forward. We pray this during these days when some are lamenting the great loss as we live more deeply into this time of not being together, of missing one another, of missing the most basic human touch. We pray, gracious God, that you will hold us in your loving arms, that even when we cannot be touched by others, we know your touch in your great presence in ourselves. We ask that you reveal yourself more to us every day in the life of Christ, whom we love. And we pray the prayer that he taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. May you find some balance, knowing the deep love of God.